Welcome to my presentation on the extensive delays and death row conditions awaiting execution. I'd like to share with you what I've learned about the extensive delays, the reasons for those delays, the conditions on death row, why I see spending an average of 16 years on death row as double punishment and therefore unconstitutional, as well as talk about the financial burdens on society and the innocent factor. My thesis statement, condemned prisoners sitting on death row for extensive periods of time while waiting for their convictions to be overturned or have their punishment carried out, is inhumane, a form of double punishment, and imposes a financial burden on society. The Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution supports my paper in that there should be no cruel or unusual punishment inflicted. The death penalty delays, in my opinion, should be considered unconstitutional. One of the reasons, the main reasons for the delays and the time spent on death row is the appellate process. I learned through my research that when someone is convicted and sentenced to death, they have an automatic appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, and if their decision is not overturned, they can appeal to the original trial court judge, and then there are several more appeals that they can attempt to have their case overturned. And it was easy to see with the levels of appeal how someone could spend so long on death row. And then it's also important to note for every 9 executions, 1 death row inmate is exonerated. This man, Madison, killed this police officer. He was convicted and sentenced to death in 1985. He was guilty without a doubt, yet due to the appeals process and technicalities, he was able to appeal over and over and over again. He would end up spending 30 years on death row. This case, the U.S. Supreme Court case Dunn versus Madison, inspired my topic as it brought to my attention the extensive delays on death row. Here is a 66-year-old man who, after going through the entire appeals process, did not have his conviction overturned and was set to be executed in 2016, and then his attorney came up with a positioning for him to be mentally incompetent to be executed. He was said to have suffered several strokes and was suffering from dementia and did not even understand why he was being executed by the state. He was said to have no recollection of committing the murder. This is a picture I wanted to share with you of a death row cell block. These cells are 6 by 9, and they are where the prisoners were initially intended to be housed while awaiting execution. It was never intended that prisoners would be housed here for years and years and years. They can spend up to 23 hours a day in these cells, and they have come up with a phrase called death row syndrome, where inmates can, due to the inhumane and miserable conditions suffered here, and the constant reminder of death and not knowing when, these inmates are attempting suicide. 40-some% were said to, a study in Florida said that 40-some% were seriously considering suicide. Another 30% actually attempted suicide. And then there are many who are giving up their appeals and volunteering to be executed because conditions are so inhumane. The financial burden on society has many different aspects. One study says that more states are spending more on capital punishment than on education. I reviewed cases that are costing 4 times more expensive than non-capital cases, and these death sentences are not being carried out. So we are spending huge amounts of money and having long delays in the process, and then only 1 in 3 are actually executed. Recently, a study showed that 10 to 15% court funding was cut, and states and local government were forced to divert funding from other areas such as hospitals, public health, police, public safety, and education. I chose the University of Pennsylvania Law Review to evaluate for my source. This piece by Kara Sharkey was very relevant and became very useful for me in my paper. Just when you think you have come up with an idea, you find someone else has published an article in a law review. So Kara talks about the delay in considering the constitutionality of inordinate delay, death row on the Eighth Amendment, which is largely what my paper is about. So as you can see, it was quite relevant. There were case study details and statistics, and it was about a 50-page review, and was quite relevant, comprehensive, and credible. The quote that I liked by Professor Melvin Urofsky is that if one is going to argue that even condemned murderers retain some spark of humanity, some rights of individual autonomy, then something must be done to either improve death row conditions or permit those who wish to terminate that existence through execution of sentence the right to do so. I motion to improving the current conditions on death row. It's not only guilty prisoners on death row. What about the mother who lost her child and then was convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of that child? What about that innocent mother? And it's easy to say that these gruesome murderers don't deserve any pity, but what if it was your mother or your family member on death row and they were innocent? Would that matter? So where I will go from here with my paper is we'll talk about the financial burden that capital punishment places on society. And I did come up with some information on the pharmaceutical companies and how they feel about being involved, having their drugs involved with capital punishment. So I need to decide if that information is relevant, important to my paper, and then I need to develop a paragraph for the opposition's argument, and then I need to wrap up nicely a summary and conclusion paragraph. Thank you for listening, and that concludes my presentation.